Birth and upbringing. Catherine de' Medici was born Caterina Maria Romula de' Medici on April 13, 1519 in Florence, Republic of Florence, the only child of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and his wife, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, the Countess of Boulogne. The young couple had been married the year before at Amboise as part of the alliance between King Francis I of France and Lorenzo's uncle Pope Leo X against the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. According to a contemporary chronicler, when Catherine was born, her parents were as pleased as if it had been a boy. Within a month of Catherine's birth, both her parents were dead. Madeleine died on April 28 of puerperal fever, and Lorenzo died on May 4. King Francis wanted Catherine to be raised at the French court, but Pope Leo refused, claiming he wanted her to marry Ippolito de' Medici. Leo made Catherine Duchess of Urbino but annexed most of the Duchy of Urbino to the Papal States, permitting Florence to keep only the fortress of San Leo. It was only after Leo's death in 1521, that his successor, Adrian VI, restored the duchy to its rightful owner, Francesco Maria I della Rovere. Catherine was first cared for by her paternal grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini. After Alfonsina's death in 1520, Catherine joined her cousins and was raised by her aunt, Clarice de' Medici. The death of Pope Leo in 1521 briefly interrupted Medici power until Cardinal Giulio de' Medici was elected Pope Clement VII in 1523. Clement housed Catherine in the Palazzo Medici Riccardi in Florence, where she lived in state. The Florentine people called her Duchessina, in deference to her unrecognized claim to the Duchy of Urbino. In 1527, the Medici were overthrown in Florence by a faction opposed to the regime of Clement's representative, Cardinal Silvio Passerini, and Catherine was taken hostage and placed in a series of convents. The final one, the Santissima Annunziata del Muret, was her home for 3 years. Mark Strutich described these years as the happiest of her entire life. Clement had no choice but to crown Charles Holy Roman Emperor in return for his help in retaking the city. In October 1529, Charles's troops laid siege to Florence. As the siege dragged on, voices called for Catherine to be killed and exposed naked and chained to the city walls. Some even suggested that she be handed over to the troops to be used for their sexual gratification. The city finally surrendered on August 12, 1530. Clement summoned Catherine from her beloved convent to join him in Rome, where he greeted her with open arms and tears in his eyes. Then he set about the business of finding her a husband. Marriage. On her visit to Rome, the Venetian envoy described Catherine as small of stature, and thin, and without delicate features, but having the protruding eyes peculiar to the Medici family. Suitors, however, lined up for her hand, including James V of Scotland, who sent the Duke of Albany to Clement to conclude a marriage in April and November 1530. When Francis I of France proposed his second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans, in early 1533, Clement jumped at the offer. Henry was a prize catch for Catherine, who, despite her wealth, was of common origin. The wedding, a grand affair marked by extravagant display and gift-giving, took place in the Église Saint-Ferréol les Augustins in Marseille on October 28, 1533. Prince Henry danced and jousted for Catherine. The 14-year-old couple left their wedding ball at midnight to perform their nuptial duties. Henry arrived in the bedroom with King Francis, who is said to have stayed until the marriage was consummated. He noted that each had shown valor in the joust. Clement visited the newlyweds in bed the next morning and added his blessings to the night's proceedings. Catherine saw little of her husband in their first year of marriage, but the ladies of the court, impressed with her intelligence and keenness to please, treated her well. However, the death of her uncle Clement on September 25, 1534 undermined Catherine's standing in the French court. The next pope, Alessandro Farnese, was elected on October 13 and took the title Paul III. As a Farnese he felt no obligation to keep Clement's promises, broke the alliance with Francis and refused to continue paying her huge dowry. King Francis lamented, "The girl has come to me stark naked." Prince Henry showed no interest in Catherine as a wife, instead, he openly took mistresses. For the first 10 years of the marriage, the royal couple failed to produce any children together. In 1537, he had a brief affair with Philippa Ducie, who gave birth to a daughter, whom he publicly acknowledged. This proved that Henry was fertile and added to the pressure on Catherine to produce a child. Dauphin. In 1536, Henry's older brother, Francis, caught a chill after a game of tennis, contracted a fever and died shortly after, leaving Henry the heir. Suspicions of poison abounded. From Catherine to Emperor Charles V, Sebastiano de Montecuccoli confessed under torture to poisoning the Dauphin. As Dauphine, Catherine was expected to provide a future heir to the throne. According to the court chronicler Brantome, many people advised the king and the Dauphin to repudiate her, since it was necessary to continue the line of France. Divorce was discussed. In desperation, Catherine tried every known trick for getting pregnant, such as placing cow dung and ground stag's antlers on her source of life, and drinking mule's urine. On January 19, 1544, she at last gave birth to a son, named after King Francis. After becoming pregnant once, Catherine had no trouble doing so again. She may have owed her change of fortune to the physician Jean Fernel, who may have noticed slight abnormalities in the couple's sexual organs and advised them how to solve the problem. However, he denied ever providing such advice. Catherine quickly conceived again and on April 2, 1545 she bore a daughter, Elizabeth. She went on to bear Henry a further 8 children, 7 of whom survived infancy, including the future Charles IX, the future Henry III, and Francis, Duke of Anjou and Claude. The long-term future of the Valois dynasty, which had ruled France since the 14th century, seemed assured. However, Catherine's ability to bear children failed to improve her marriage. About 1538, at the age of 19, Henry had taken as his mistress the 38-year-old Diane de Poitiers, whom he adored for the rest of his life. Even so, he respected Catherine's status as his consort. When King Francis I died on March 31, 1547, Catherine became Queen Consort of France. She was crowned in the Basilica of Saint Denis on June 10, 1549. Queen of France. Henry allowed Catherine almost no political influence as queen. Although she sometimes acted as regent during his absences from France, her powers were strictly nominal. Henry gave the chateau of Chenonceau, which Catherine had wanted for herself, to Diane de Poitiers, who took her place at the center of power, dispensing patronage and accepting favors. The imperial ambassador reported that in the presence of guests, Henry would sit on Diane's lap and play the guitar, chat about politics, or fondle her breasts. Diane never regarded Catherine as a threat. She even encouraged the king to spend more time with Catherine and sire more children. In 1556, Catherine nearly died giving birth to twin daughters, Joan and Victoire. Surgeons saved her life by breaking the legs of Joan, who died in her womb. The surviving daughter, Victoire, died 7 weeks later. Because their birth very nearly cost Catherine her life, the king's physician advised the king that there should be no more children. Therefore, Henry too stopped visiting his wife's bedroom and spent all his time with his longtime mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine had no more children. Henry's reign also saw the rise of the Guise brothers, Charles, who became a cardinal, and Henry's boyhood friend Francis, who became Duke of Guise. Their sister Mary of Guise had married James V of Scotland in 1538 and was the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. At the age of 5½, Mary was brought to the French court, where she was promised to the Dauphin, Francis. Catherine brought her up with her own children at the French court, while Mary of Guise governed Scotland as her daughter's regent. On 3–4 April 1559, Henry signed the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis with the Holy Roman Empire and England, ending a long period of Italian wars. The treaty was sealed by the betrothal of Catherine's 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth to Philip II of Spain. Their proxy wedding, in Paris on June 22, 1559, was celebrated with festivities, balls, masks, and 5 days of justing. King Henry took part in the justing, sporting Diane's black and white colors. He defeated the Dukes of Guise and Nemours, but the young Gabriel, Comte de Montgomery, knocked him half out of the saddle. Henry insisted on riding against Montgomery again, and this time, Montgomery's lance shattered in the king's face. Henry reeled out of the clash, his face pouring blood, with splinters of a good bigness sticking out of his eye and head. Catherine, Diane, and Prince Francis all fainted. Henry was carried to the Château de Tournelles, where 5 splinters of wood were extracted from his head, one of which had pierced his eye and brain. Catherine stayed by his bedside, but Diane kept away, for fear, in the words of a chronicler, of being expelled by the Queen. For the next 10 days, Henry's state fluctuated. At times he even felt well enough to dictate letters and listen to music. Slowly, however, he lost his sight, speech, and reason, and on July 10, 1559 he died, aged 40. From that day, Catherine took a broken lance as her emblem, inscribed with the words Lacrymae hin dolor, and wore black mourning in memory of Henry. Queen Mother. Reign of Francis II. Francis II became king at the age of 15. In what has been called a coup d'état, the Cardinal of Lorraine and the Duke of Guise, whose niece, Mary, Queen of Scots, had married Francis II the year before, seized power the day after Henry II's death and quickly moved themselves into the Louvre Palace with the young couple. The English ambassador reported a few days later that the House of Guise ruleth and doth all about the French king. For the moment, Catherine worked with the Guises out of necessity. She was not strictly entitled to a role in Francis's government, because he was deemed old enough to rule for himself. Nevertheless, all his official acts began with the words, "This being the good pleasure of the Queen, my Lady Mother, and I also approving of every opinion that she holdeth, am content and command that." Catherine did not hesitate to exploit her new authority. One of her first acts was to force Diane de Poitiers to hand over the crown jewels and return the Château de Chenonceau to the crown. She later did her best to efface or outdo Diane's building work there. The Guise brothers set about persecuting the Protestants with zeal. Catherine adopted a moderate stance and spoke against the Guise persecutions, though she had no particular sympathy for the Huguenots, whose beliefs she never shared. The Protestants looked for leadership first to Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, the first prince of the blood, and then, with more success, to his brother, Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, who backed a plot to overthrow the Guises by force. When the Guises heard of the plot, they moved the court to the fortified Château of Amboise. The Duke of Guise launched an attack into the woods around the château. His troops surprised the rebels and killed many of them on the spot, including the commander, La Renaudie. Others they drowned in the river or strung up around the battlements while Catherine and the court watched. In June 1560, Michel de l'Hospital was appointed Chancellor of France. He sought the support of France's constitutional bodies and worked closely with Catherine to defend the law in the face of the growing anarchy. Neither saw the need to punish Protestants who worshipped in private and did not take up arms. On August 20, 1560, Catherine and the Chancellor advocated this policy to an assembly of notables at Fontainebleau. Historians regard the occasion as an early example of Catherine's statesmanship. Meanwhile, Condé raised an army and in autumn 1560 began attacking towns in the south. Catherine ordered him to court and had him imprisoned as soon as he arrived. He was tried in November, found guilty of offences against the crown, and sentenced to death. His life was saved by the illness and death of the king, as a result of an infection or an abscess in his ear. When Catherine realized Francis was going to die, she made a pact with Antoine de Bourbon by which he would renounce his right to the regency of the future king, Charles IX, in return for the release of his brother Condé. As a result, when Francis died on December 5, 1560, the Privy Council appointed Catherine as governor of France, with sweeping powers. She wrote to her daughter Elizabeth, "My principal aim is to have the honor of God before my eyes in all things and to preserve my authority, not for myself, but for the conservation of this kingdom and for the good of all your brothers." Reign of Charles IX. Charles IX was 9 years old at the time of his coronation, during which he cried. At first Catherine kept him very close to her, and even slept in his chamber. She presided over his council, decided policy, and controlled state business and patronage. However, she was never in a position to control the country as a whole, which was on the brink of civil war. In many parts of France the rule of nobles held sway rather than that of the crown. The challenges Catherine faced were complex and in some ways difficult for her to comprehend as a foreigner. She summoned church leaders from both sides to attempt to solve their doctrinal differences. Despite her optimism, the resulting colloquy of Poissy ended in failure on October 13, 1561, dissolving itself without her permission. Catherine failed because she saw the religious divide only in political terms. In the words of historian R. J. Knecht, she underestimated the strength of religious conviction, imagining that all would be well if only she could get the party leaders to agree. In January 1562, Catherine issued the Tolerant Edict of Saint-Germain in a further attempt to build bridges with the Protestants. On March 1, 1562, however, in an incident known as the Massacre of Vassy, the Duke of Guise and his men attacked worshipping Huguenots in a barn at Vassy, killing 74 and wounding 104. Guise, who called the massacre a regrettable accident, was cheered as a hero in the streets of Paris while the Huguenots called for revenge. The massacre lit the fuse that sparked the French Wars of Religion. For the next 30 years, France found itself in a state of either civil war or armed truce. Within a month Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, and Admiral Gaspard de Coligny had raised an army of 1,800. They formed an alliance with England and seized town after town in France. Catherine met Coligny, but he refused to back down. She therefore told him, "Since you rely on your forces, we will show you ours." The royal army struck back quickly and laid siege to Huguenot-held Rouen. Catherine visited the deathbed of Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, after he was fatally wounded by an arquebus shot. Catherine insisted on visiting the field herself and when warned of the dangers laughed, "My courage is as great as yours." The Catholics took Rouen, but their triumph was short-lived. On February 18, 1563, a spy called Paul Trot de Mere fired an arquebus into the back of the Duke of Guise, at the siege of Orleans. The murder triggered an aristocratic blood feud that complicated the French civil wars for years to come. Catherine, however, was delighted with the death of her ally. If Monsieur de Guise had perished sooner, she told the Venetian ambassador, peace would have been achieved more quickly. On March 19, 1563, the Edict of Amboise, also known as the Edict of Pacification, ended the war. Catherine now rallied both Huguenot and Catholic forces to retake Le Havre from the English. Huguenots. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Reign of Henry III. 2 years later, Catherine faced a new crisis with the death of Charles IX at the age of 23. His dying words were, "Oh, my mother." The day before he died, he named Catherine regent, since his brother and heir, Henry the Duke of Anjou, was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he had been elected king the year before. However, 3 months after his coronation at Wawel Cathedral, Henry abandoned that throne and returned to France in order to become King of France. Catherine wrote to Henry of Charles IX's death, "I am grief-stricken to have witnessed such a scene and the love which he showed me at the end. My only consolation is to see you here soon, as your kingdom requires, and in good health, for if I were to lose you, I would have myself buried alive with you." Henry was Catherine's favourite son. Unlike his brothers, he came to the throne as a grown man. He was also healthier, though he suffered from weak lungs and constant fatigue. His interest in the tasks of government, however, proved fitful. He depended on Catherine and her team of secretaries until the last few weeks of her life. He often hid from state affairs, immersing himself in acts of piety, such as pilgrimages and flagellation. Henry married Louise de Lorraine-Vaudemont in February 1575, 2 days after his coronation. His choice thwarted Catherine's plans for a political marriage to a foreign princess. Rumors of Henry's inability to produce children were by that time in wide circulation. The papal nuncio Salviati observed, "It is only with difficulty that we can imagine there will be offspring. Physicians and those who know him well say that he has an extremely weak constitution and will not live long." As time passed and the likelihood of children from the marriage receded, Catherine's youngest son, Francis, Duke of Alençon, known as Monsieur, played upon his role as heir to the throne, repeatedly exploiting the anarchy of the civil wars, which were by now as much about noble power struggles as religion. Catherine did all in her power to bring Francis back into the fold. On one occasion, in March 1578, she lectured him for 6 hours about his dangerously subversive behavior. In 1576, in a move that endangered Henry's throne, Francis allied with the Protestant princes against the crown. On May 6, 1576, Catherine gave in to almost all Huguenot demands in the Edict of Beaulieu. The treaty became known as the Peace of Monsieur because it was thought that Francis had forced it on the crown. Francis died of consumption in June 1584, after a disastrous intervention in the Low Countries during which his army had been massacred. Catherine wrote, "The next day, I am so wretched to live long enough to see so many people die before me, although I realize that God's will must be obeyed, that He owns everything, and that He lends us only for as long as He likes the children whom He gives us." The death of her youngest son was a calamity for Catherine's dynastic dreams. Under Salic law, by which only males could ascend the throne, the Huguenot Henry of Navarre now became heir presumptive to the French crown. Catherine had at least taken the precaution of marrying Margaret, her youngest daughter, to Navarre. Margaret, however, became almost as much of a thorn in Catherine's side as Francis, and in 1582, she returned to the French court without her husband. Catherine was heard yelling at her for taking lovers. Catherine sent Pomponne de Bellievre to Navarre to arrange Margaret's return. In 1585, Margaret fled Navarre again. She retreated to her property at Agen and begged her mother for money. Catherine sent her only enough to put food on her table. Moving on to the fortress of Carlat, Margaret took a lover called D'Aubiac. Catherine asked Henry to act before Margaret brought shame on them again. In October 1586, therefore, he had Margaret locked up in the Château d'Usson. D'Aubiac was executed, though not, despite Catherine's wish, in front of Margaret. Catherine cut Margaret out of her will and never saw her again. Catherine was unable to control Henry in the way she had Francis and Charles. Her role in his government became that of chief executive and roving diplomat. She travelled widely across the kingdom, enforcing his authority and trying to head off war. In 1578, she took on the task of pacifying the south. At the age of 59, she embarked on an 18-month journey around the south of France to meet Huguenot leaders face to face. Her efforts won Catherine new respect from the French people. On her return to Paris in 1579, she was greeted outside the city by the Parliament and crowds. The Venetian ambassador, Girolamo Lippomano, wrote, "She is an indefatigable princess, born to tame and govern a people as unruly as the French. They now recognize her merits, her concern for unity, and are sorry not to have appreciated her sooner." She was under no illusions, however. On November 25, 1579, she wrote to the king, "You are on the eve of a general revolt. Anyone who tells you differently is a liar." Catholic League. Last months and death. Patron of the arts. Catherine believed in the humanist ideal of the learned Renaissance prince whose authority depended on letters as well as arms. She was inspired by the example of her father-in-law, King Francis I of France, who had hosted the leading artists of Europe at his court, and by her Medici ancestors. In an age of civil war and declining respect for the monarchy, she sought to bolster royal prestige through lavish cultural display. Once in control of the royal purse, she launched a program of artistic patronage that lasted for 3 decades. During this time, she presided over a distinctive late French Renaissance culture in all branches of the arts. An inventory drawn up at the Hôtel de la Reine after Catherine's death shows her to have been a keen collector. Listed works of art included tapestries, hand-drawn maps, sculptures, rich fabrics, ebony furniture inlaid with ivory, sets of china, and Limoges pottery. There were also hundreds of portraits, for which a vogue had developed during Catherine's lifetime. Many portraits in her collection were by Jean Clouet and his son François Clouet. François Clouet drew and painted portraits of all Catherine's family and of many members of the court. After Catherine's death, a decline in the quality of French portraiture set in. By 1610, the school patronized by the late Valois court and brought to its pinnacle by François Clouet had all but died out. Beyond portraiture, little is known about the painting at Catherine de' Medici's court. In the last 2 decades of her life, only 2 painters stand out as recognizable personalities, Jean Cousin the Younger, few of whose works survive, and Antoine Caron, who became Catherine's official painter after working at Fontainebleau under Primatico. Caron's vivid mannerism, with its love of ceremonial and its preoccupation with massacres, reflects the neurotic atmosphere of the French court during the wars of religion. Many of Caron's paintings, such as those of the triumphs of the seasons, are of allegorical subjects that echo the festivities for which Catherine's court was famous. His designs for the Valois tapestries celebrate the fêtes, picnics, and mock battles of the magnificent entertainments hosted by Catherine. They depict events held at Fontainebleau in 1564, at Bayonne in 1565 for the summit meeting with the Spanish court, and at the Tuileries in 1573 for the visit of the Polish ambassadors who presented the Polish crown to Catherine's son Henry of Anjou. The musical shows in particular allowed Catherine to express her creative gifts. They were usually dedicated to the ideal of peace in the realm and based on mythological themes. To create the necessary dramas, music, and scenic effects for these events, Catherine employed the leading artists and architects of the day. Historian Francis Yates has called her a great creative artist in festivals. Catherine gradually introduced changes to the traditional entertainments. For example, she increased the prominence of dance in the shows that climaxed each series of entertainments. A distinctive new art form, the ballet de cour, emerged from these creative advances. Owing to its synthesis of dance, music, verse, and setting, the production of the Ballet Comique de la Reine in 1581 is regarded by scholars as the first authentic ballet. Catherine de' Medici's great love among the arts was architecture. As the daughter of the Medici, suggests French art historian Jean-Pierre Babylon, she was driven by a passion to build and a desire to leave great achievements behind her when she died. After Henry II's death, Catherine set out to immortalize her husband's memory and to enhance the grandeur of the Valois monarchy through a series of costly building projects. These included work on the Château de Monceau, Château de Saint-Maur, and Chenonceau. Catherine built 2 new palaces in Paris, the Tuileries and the Hôtel de la Reine. She was closely involved in the planning and supervising of all her architectural schemes. Catherine had emblems of her love and grief carved into the stonework of her buildings. Poets lauded her as the new Artemisia, after Artemisia II of Caria, who built the mausoleum at Halicarnassus as a tomb for her dead husband. As the centerpiece of an ambitious new chapel, she commissioned a magnificent tomb for Henry at the Basilica of Saint Denis. It was designed by Francesco Primaticcio, with sculpture by Germain Pilon. Art historian Henri Zierner has called this monument the last and most brilliant of the royal tombs of the Renaissance. Catherine also commissioned Germain Pilon to carve the marble sculpture that contains Henry II's heart. A poem by Ronsard, engraved on its base, tells the reader not to wonder that so small a vase can hold so large a heart, since Henry's real heart resides in Catherine's breast. Although Catherine spent ruinous sums on the arts, most of her patronage left no permanent legacy. The end of the Valois dynasty so soon after her death brought a change in priorities. Culinary legend. The legend that de' Medici introduced a long list of foods, techniques, and utensils from Italy to France is discredited by food historians. Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton and Stephen Mennell provided the definitive arguments against these claims. They point out that Catherine's father-in-law, King Francis I, and the flower of the French aristocracy had dined at some of Italy's most elite tables during the king's Italian campaigns, that a vast Italian entourage had visited France for the wedding of Catherine de' Medici's father to her French-born mother, and that she had little influence at court until her husband's death because he was so besotted by his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. In fact, a large population of Italians, bankers, silk weavers, philosophers, musicians, and artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, had emigrated to France to promote the burgeoning Renaissance. Nevertheless, popular culture frequently attributes Italian culinary influence and forks in France to Catherine. The earliest known reference to Catherine as the popularizer of Italian culinary innovation is the entry for cuisine in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie published in 1754, which describes haute cuisine as decadent and effeminate and explains that fussy sauces and fancy fricassees arrived in France via that crowd of corrupt Italians who served at the court of Catherine de' Medici. Links to the occult. Catherine de' Medici has been labeled by Wiccan Gerald Gardner a sinister queen, noted for her interest in the occult arts. Catherine and Henry's inability to produce an heir for the first 10 years of their marriage gave rise to suspicion of witchcraft. Leibovy suggested that women's power was believed to be the ability to create and sustain life, whilst witches were believed to have the opposite power, that of attacking health, life, and fertility. An infertile woman, and in particular an infertile queen, was therefore regarded as unnatural and a small step from supernatural. Elizabeth I was treated with similar suspicion. She too entertained questionable characters, and produced no official heir. Essentially, however, there exists no concrete proof that either woman took part in the occult, and it is now believed that Catherine's trouble in providing an heir was in fact due to Henry II's penile deformity. Catherine herself had been educated in astrology and astronomy, which were closely linked in her day and were an academic rather than a satanic activity. It has been suggested that Catherine educated her son, Henry III, in the dark arts, and that the two devoted themselves to sorceries that were scandals of the age. As a result, some authors believe Catherine to be the creator of the Black Mass, a satanic inversion of the traditional Catholic Mass, although there is little to prove this aside from Jean Bodin's account in his book De la Demonomanie des Sorciers. Nevertheless, Catherine was never formally accused or prosecuted despite the fact that her reign experienced the greatest number of prosecutions for witchcraft in Italy. This lends some weight to the suggestion that people were labeled witches simply because they did not act the way a woman would have been expected to act, or simply to suit personal or political agendas. This may be particularly true for Catherine as an Italian woman ruling in France. Several historians argue that she was disliked by her French subjects, who labeled her the Italian woman. In any event, the rumors have made a mark on Catherine's reputation over time, and there are now many dramaticist works about her involvement in the occult. In popular culture, Catherine is portrayed by Megan Follows on the CW television series, Reign. She is a main character in all 4 seasons of the series and the only character other than Mary, Queen of Scots, who appeared in every episode. Catherine is depicted as powerful and strong-willed. She is extremely loyal and willing to do whatever it takes, no matter the deadly price, to protect her sons, their rule, and their legacy. Catherine is often at odds with Mary because she sees her as a threat to her family. Catherine is also portrayed in the book Medici's Daughter, a novel of Marguerite de Valois by Sophie Perrineau, which follows Margaret of Valois. Vernalisi assumed the role of Catherine in La Reine Margot, a 1994 French film directed by Patrice Giraud based on the novel La Reine Margot by Alexandre Dumas. In both the novel and the film, Catherine appears as a scheming villainess. The same year, the Italian actress received a Best Actress award at the Cannes Film Festival and a César Award for Best Supporting Actress. Samantha Morton portrays Catherine in the Starz television series, The Serpent Queen. The younger Catherine is portrayed by Liv Hill. The series is based on the book Catherine de' Medici, Renaissance Queen of France by Leone Frida. Issue: Catherine de' Medici married Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future Henry II of France, in Marseille on October 28, 1533. She gave birth to 10 children, of whom 4 sons and 3 daughters survived to marriageable age. 3 of her sons became kings of France, while 2 of her daughters married kings and 1 married a duke. Catherine outlived all her children except Henry III, who died 7 months after her, and Margaret, who inherited her robust health. Victoire and Jean were twin daughters born in 1556. Jean was stillborn due to surgeons breaking her legs to save her mother's life. Victoire survived, dying less than 2 months later. According to the diplomat Simon Renard, the birth nearly killed Catherine, and the royal couple were advised by the king's physician to have no further children. Francis II, King of France, married Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1558. Elizabeth married Philip II, King of Spain, in 1559. Claude married Charles III, Duke of Lorraine, in 1559. Louis, Duke of Orleans, died in infancy. Charles IX, King of France, married Elizabeth of Austria in 1570. Henry III, King of France, married Louise of Lorraine in 1575. Margaret married Henry, King of Navarre, the future Henry IV of France, in 1572. Hercules, Duke of Anjou, renamed Francis when he was confirmed. Victoire. Died in infancy. Jean. Stillborn. Ancestry.